If you ever go to a chassis shop for a setup and a scale, and they don't give you a chassis plot, you should probably ask them why. The reason we got this red car on the hoist here is it came in for a scale and setup. It's a nice little street car, it's got a lot of power, but there isn't a week that goes by that we do not get questions on how to properly set pinion angle and how to make sure that the rear end is centered and squared in the car. So today we're going to go over what you have to do to properly center and square your rear end and to accurately check pinion angle. Some of the tools you'll need for our suspension is a 1 inch and an 1 1/8 wrench, a tape measure. We use a digital angle finder for pinion angle. We have a machine 1-2-3 block that we use, and we definitely need a pad of paper and a pencil to write your measurements down. So the first thing that we do, if you want to come on over here, is we visually inspect that the wheel is centered in the wheel opening. We look at the spacing in the front and the spacing in the rear, and we want to make sure that it's symmetrical, that both the gap in the front of the tire and the gap to the rear of the tire are centered in the wheel well, and that it looks like it's supposed to be, because we always set everything up visually first and then we go in and take measurements because it just saves time. Then we want to come behind the car, and from this point behind the car you want to look at both sides and see that the rear end is centered in the car from the driver's side to the passenger side. And you can do that by referencing the molding or the outside of the quarter panel to its reference to the tire. And that will let you know that the rear end is pretty close side to side and front to rear by doing just those two simple things. And then the next thing we do, once we do that, we go and take a couple measurements. But before we take the measurements, I want to go over what we typically do if the thrust isn't correct. If the rear end is too far forward or rearward. If the rear end is too far forward, this rear end setup, this suspension setup has a double adjuster. So if this wheel was too far forward in the wheel opening, we would adjust this double adjuster and push the wheel back. Now if the rear end isn't centered side to side, you use your upper control arms. So if the rear end was too far to the passenger side, you would lengthen the passenger upper control arm while you shorten the driver upper control arm. And the reason that you do both of them at the same time is so that you don't change the pinion angle while you're moving this around. So you want to get the pinion angle, get the rear end centered and squared before you go into adjusting the pinion angle. Now if you look at the rear bolts on this housing, it's a 6-point hex bolt, and the point is facing forward. And it doesn't always have to be. It can be a point or a flat, and we're lucky because both rear end bolts has a point facing forward on the housing. And what we've done here is we've plumb bobbed the car, and we've put a little piece of metal between the subframes. We've pinch clamped it in between the subframes, and we've marked center on this. So this is the center of the car. What we did is we dropped plumb bobs off the front of the car, the rear of the car, measured between them, and then we took a laser and shot a line and marked this as the center of the car. So that is the true center of the car. So what you want to do is, take your first measurement. You go from this center line that we have here back to the point on the bolt, and you have exactly 51 inches. So now you come over here to the other side and repeat the process, do the same thing, and again you have exactly 51 inches. So this rear end is perfectly centered and squared. There's no thrust and there's no side to side. And if you needed to correct that, you would use your upper and lower control arms to either move it side to side or move the thrust front or rear on the car. Once that's done, you know that the rear end is centered and squared, and then you can go into setting pinion angle. So let's grab our tools and go on back, and I'll show you how to check pinion angle. One of the first things that you want to do is you want to inspect everything. You want to make sure that your drive line angle is straight. One of the first things that you want to do is come look at your transmission to drive shaft angle. Sometimes you can't tell. This is a T5 5-speed transmission, it's hard to tell because it's tight up in the tunnel. So what we would do is we'd use our angle finder to make sure everything is right, and we'd look at the angle on the drive shaft, and once this settles down, it's at 2.4 degrees running downward towards the back. There's no spot to really get the angle, driveline angle of the engine and transmission, but we know the crankshaft center line is perfectly in line with the input and the output shaft on the transmission. So we come up here to the front of the crankshaft and go off of the vibration dampener. In this case, they've got a set of pulleys, and we check the angle on there, and it is 3 degrees down. So we're about a half a degree off between the transmission and the drive shaft. A half a degree is about as much as you want, and the way that you correct that, if you do have more than a half a degree, 0 would be perfect, and 0 is achievable. And if you wanted that, you shim the back of the transmission. You either stack washers or get shims made and put them under and bring the back of the transmission up until you have the same degree as your drive shaft. And that will ensure that your drive shaft to transmission angle is correct. Now we know that the drive shaft angle is -2.5. So this is on here. The drive shaft is running down towards the pinion angle, down towards the pinion at a 2.5 degree angle. So I've got this little illustration here, and the drive shaft, since it's running downhill, will reference is -2.5. So we have a 2.5 degree downward angle towards the pinion. We're lucky that this is a 9-inch in this car, because it's very easy to check the pinion angle, the actual angle of the pinion on the 9-inch, because the flat on the drive shaft yoke. So what we do is we set that on there and we hold it tight, and we have a -1 degree. So the pinion itself is going downward at 1 degree. So you register that as a -1. Okay? So what you would do is you would add the two. People think that they subtract one from the other. They're both negative, they're both going downward, so you would add it. So a -1 plus a -2.5 is a -3.5 degree pinion angle. So how you adjust it, when you want to put more positive pinion angle in, you lengthen your upper control arm. The upper control arms have these double adjusters on them, and typically I have a Sharpie and I mark one, but this one isn't that far off because we kind of preset it up. So all we have to do is lengthen each control arm, and we'll start by using flats. These hexagon adjusters, they're a 6-sided flat, and you take your 1-inch wrench and you typically turn counting flats. So there's 1 flat, 2 flats, 3 flats, and then you come over to the other side and you do the exact same thing. 1 flat, 2 flats, 3 flats. And the reason you want to adjust them both the same amount is so that the rear end doesn't move side to side. If you're lengthening them both the same amount, it will keep the rear end in the same position. If you lengthen and shorten one, it'll move it left or right. If you lengthen them both the same, as you lengthen this one, it will move the rear end that way. As you lengthen that one, it'll move the rear end back that way. So let's double check and see what the 3 flats did for us. So 3 flats took 1/10 of a degree out. We're at 2.4 now. And let's see what it did here. We're at 0.2. So that gives us a 2.6. We're pretty close to that magic number, 2.5. We could probably go 1 more flat and have it exactly as we need it. So you go and turn it, lengthen it 1 flat, a little bit off there, 1 flat, 1 flat. Come back, verify. And you got to do this as many times as it takes to get where you need. So now we're at 2.3. And 0.2. So that gives us our -2.5 that I'd recommend for this tire on the stick shift car with solid bushing. So 2.5 is a pretty good pinion angle. This car should hook fairly well. Once you're done doing that, you want to go back and you want to tighten up your jam nuts. You know, the left side, right side. What we typically do is tighten them first by hand so that they don't move on you. You take your 1 1/8 wrench, snug it a little bit, snug that a little bit, then take your 1 inch wrench, hold it, snug that up. Then snug that, and typically what we do is we take a paint pencil and we mark them. Mark the jam nut to the body and the jam nut to the adjuster, so that way you know if your nuts are coming loose or moving or anything like that. And that's how you set pinion it. It's pretty simple and straightforward. You don't have to make it very complicated. Just remember that if the drive shaft angle is going downward towards the pinion, it's negative. If it's going upward towards the pinion, it's positive. If the pinion is going downward towards the drive shaft, it's negative. If it's going upward towards the drive shaft, it's positive. And then you always add the two. For instance, if you had a +1 and a -2.5 and you added them, you'd have a -1.5 pinion angle. I hope this helps you guys. I hope this is a good reference for people that are unsure on how to set their pinion angle. Always check all your drive line angles. Check all your nuts and bolts when you're done. Make sure everything's tight, and go have fun racing your car. So we just finished setting up this red car and scaling it and setting the pinion angle on. If you ever go to a chassis shop for a setup and a scale, and they don't give you a chassis plot, you should probably ask them why, because it's one of the most important things that when they set up your suspension, that you have a map of the suspension geometry. If you take a look at this right here, this is a blown up version of the chassis plot on this car. Whenever I do a scale or a setup for somebody, I always ask them if they want this. If they want this, I'm happy to print them off a copy. If they don't want it, I always keep records. I've done probably 5,000 cars in the last 20 years, and I have them all saved. I've got every plot that I've ever done saved. So if you ever go to a shop and they don't want to provide you with the data about your car, or they say that it's top secret, maybe you need to start looking for a different shop to do your setup.